Once upon a time, a small girl was born with injuries to her hands and her feet. The people around her cried and lamented that she wouldn't ever play the piano or even tie her own shoelaces. But in time, she managed to create her own way of doing what others could do. Other children threw sticks and stones, and some adults stood over her and remarked that she was so clever for being able to hold a spoon. These early encounters made her sad and angry, so she decided to show them that she was also capable of bending spoons. She also discovered the importance of reading people by their smell. She learned that fear has its very own smell, that anger has an acidic scent, that cruelty and brutality smell like mold. Lies and betrayal smell like the sorts of plastic that, when tasted, coat the back of your throat with a nasty poison that takes forever to fade. There were many layers to the smells. Anger was frequently accompanied by the smell of beer. Control and impending violence was often laced with cigarette smoke and whiskey. Fear was sour. Lies and betrayal carried a strong cologne of musk and metal. Rage was a foul-smelling breath. Love, too, had its own vast library of scents, from talcum powder to red wine and roses. From hectic hormones to heartbreak, love commands a very broad palette of scented motives. And illness, the cruelest generator of odours that repel, repulse, and report on the body's deepest truths. All of the smells drew for our girl a map, a path to safety, and pointers to dangers. She began to imagine possibilities for responding to the scent map, with her own scent stories that cloaked her, that comforted her, that shone a light, showing her the way. Many years later, as she wandered through the perfume section of a large department store, a bevy of sales assistants swarmed around her with spray bottles poised to mark her with the stories of mass-produced chemistry that she couldn't understand. She shook her head and kept going. One sales assistant was so insistent that our girl stopped her from speaking by reaching out and gently taking the sales assistant's arm. And lifting the woman's wrist to her nose, she inhaled. The sales assistant was shocked. "This isn't your perfume," said our girl. "Your own perfume is warm and spiced with nuts and aromatic woods. This is only a cold laundry musk with wet nappy florals drowning in melon syrup sprayed onto you." And she led the sales assistant tenderly by the arm to a shelf stocked with men's perfumes, and she spritzed a tiny amount of a lesser-known fragrance on the woman's inner arm and invited the sales assistant to take a whiff. The sales assistant's eyes grew wide and her mouth said, "Wow." 9 more sales assistants now crowded around our girl, eagerly holding their wrists out. "Smell me, please," they asked. Hello, I'm Teone, and I'd like to have a little chat about some of the ethos behind my methods of making perfume. I'll foreground that by just apologising that it probably sounds quite chaotic to those of you who are much more familiar with the mainstream method of making perfume. But I thought it might be interesting to just talk about some of my crackpot theories and ways of going about it. So a few people wrote some really useful prompts for me to to answer or to talk about. And one of the things was the relationship between aromatherapy and natural perfumery. And I'd like to set that aside for now and make a video very soon about that specifically. But for now, I just want to talk about some stranger concepts as building blocks for the way that I go about making perfume. So I'll talk a little bit about, first of all, the construct. When I have a sudden urge to make a new perfume, I tend to think about it differently in that I don't consider the hierarchical structure of top notes, heart notes or middle notes and base notes as being the framework of a perfume. I tend to think about it more in terms of maybe a terrarium or an aquarium. So it's a three-dimensional sort of rectangular space. And maybe also something like a little mini theatre. So some kind of a drama is going to be enacted inside that theatre space. And before we begin, I need to consider the structure of it. So there's going to be a soil bed into which we can imagine some seeds being planted into that soil bed. I'm going to think about the perfume's moisture content, not in a literal sense, but in terms of the overall the outcome of that perfume being, is it going to be a wet perfume, a tropical kind of humid perfume that would fit into some wild dancing in Cuba? You know, we're going to Havana with this perfume. Or is it something to be considered in a very still, dry place, somewhere up in a very high altitude, in a hermitage, in some kind of a quiet, snow-covered expanse? How much air and light do we want to conjure in the perfume? What season does it really, really sit well with? And I want to assert that the story of the perfume is the terroir, you know, the environment, the ecology, the bounds of that perfume. So what drama happens here in this little theatre space, in this little landscape, and what resolves that drama? Now, they may all seem like very abstract kinds of concepts, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. So some of the things, the questions and answers that I've put to myself in my development as a maker is to ask myself, when smelling an ingredient, so if I take, for example, some jasmine sambac and hold it to my nose, I ask myself the question, which direction does that perfume travel, the perfume of that single essence? And for me, jasmine sambac goes, it's like a horizontal landscape, a line from side to side, whereas jasmine grandiflorum is vertical. That helps me to consider the sonography of the perfume's ecology. So within that aquarium or that terrarium, there's this three-dimensionality to it. There's a spatial kind of flow, a mise en scene of depth and shadows and light, and I want to conjure this kind of dramatic landscape of elements within that terroir. So once I've determined that, for example, that jasmine sambac is a very horizontal, how do I describe that? It's as if when I smell it, the energy of it is very wide. But the energy of smell when I'm smelling jasmine grandiflorum is that it's it's got depth. And I apologise if that makes no sense. But the accords of my perfume compositions are what gives those perfumes the skeleton on which you can then start to build up the layers, of extrapolations, elaborations, and textures. So the accords provide that skeletal kind of framework. So if you know that there's strength, there's a horizontal strength in the jasmine sambac, we want to match that with another ingredient that's going to either reinforce that direction or lash to it in a horizontal and vertical kind of configuration, so that you end up having those walls, the skeleton of the walls of your terrarium really strong. So the constituents have temperature, they have direction, they have a moisture content. All of these things may correspond directly with the season in which that particular plant was harvested. When does that particular plant flower or fruit? When is it at its most fertile? So these inherent botanical rhythms and patterns are really important in accounting for what you're going to add into your composition when working with naturals. So the accords, one of the important things that I think are bound to making successful accords, and I'll use the example of something like a wood accord. If you are working with something like sandalwood, which is a very expensive ingredient, and you want to expand the breadth and the depth of that particular fragrance, and you've got limited amount of sandalwood to work with, then find ingredients that extend the qualities of that sandalwood. So there's a dry, sour element to Santalum album. Often when I'm working with sandalwood, I taste it in the back of my mouth before I can smell it. The molecules seem to really directly hit on my taste buds before my nose even begins to unpack what I'm smelling. So that's always a good indicator for me that it's real or it's good quality sandalwood. Some of the other aspects of sandalwood is there's that creamy sweetness, and it's very varied from batch to batch. Sometimes it's a little bit it's a little bit gourmand. Sometimes it's a little floral, but whatever is appearing in the sandalwood that you want to work with, it's really worthwhile to find some corresponding similarities in another essence. So for example, when I made Avant Gardenia, I had a bunch of just picked gardenia flowers in front of me, and I wanted to use natural absolutes and essential oils without touching tuberose, because tuberose smells nothing like gardenias, even though it's somehow become a habit for people to put tuberose into perfumes that they then called gardenia. So I looked for qualities in that in the gardenia blossom that I could detect similarities from other flowers, and I found that jasmine sambac and gardenia share some characteristics. So there's a sharpness in both of them. Gardenia has that very lactonic kind of milky smell, which is not present so much in the sandbag. So you need to find a joiner. And a joiner is a really important part of making a cohesive fragrance. So what's going to join sambac to a living gardenia blossom, to take away some of the greenness of sambac and bring it closer to that. So you start to look at other flowers and build up a kind of, I guess, a chiaroscuric effect of smoke and mirrors to gather a bouquet of other flowers that are going to lend certain qualities to the composition that brings it into company with that gardenia flower. So I found some really important qualities in German chamomile. I used some galbanum, the sambac. I added vanilla and a range of other, some champaka in very minuscule quantities, not just a big kind of gloop of those things, but drop by drop to find where it begins to take the same scent profile as the gardenia flower. It was a very difficult and complex experiment, but I reached a point in the composition where I was just happy to kind of stand back from it, and the name Avant Gardenia was perfect because there wasn't any gardenia in there, only in the inspiration place that it taught me. It taught me so much to sit there with those beautiful white milky blooms as they gradually turned yellow and then faded to brown. They taught me many secrets about that incredible smell. So those joiners are really important in building up your accords. When you know what your story is, the story that you want to tell, that it becomes the terroir of or the territory, the landscape of your drama inside that place. And you've taken care of things like building up a soil bed, putting the gravel and the sand in place. And they may be things like resins, dense woods, the bottom heavy things that are going to really anchor your elements. And the whole idea of that three-dimensional space is that some things in a perfume story need to be very close to the viewer, that you need to see them as perhaps the fish that come up close to the glass and look at you, and at the same time you're able to see that there's beautiful plants waving in the slight kind of the tide of that aquarium, and hiding behind that might be some sea snails or some other shy fish, or things that spend most of their time burrowed under the top layer of the gravel, things that swim up the top, things that stay down the bottom, things that are close to you, things that are further back. All of those elements in a perfume make up this kind of very detailed, very three-dimensional experience. Some people have said that my perfumes feel three-dimensional, that they feel real. And that's because of this structure, because they are made from real plants. And another element too is that a natural perfume isn't finished when the perfumer puts the stopper on the bottle. It takes quite a long time for things to propagate, for things to bloom and grow. And using the analogy of, say, a landscape gardener who plants, tiny seedlings into a space with the vision that space is going to be glorious 10, 15, 20 years from now, that it's not something that he can pack up his tools at the end of that project and say it's finished. It's really only just begun. It's just time and space that will give that work of art and that collaboration between nature and a human being what it needs to bloom and grow. And it's the same with natural perfume. They are never finished works. They continue to evolve, to mature, to transcend my expectations, to arrive at some pretty amazing places under their own steam. So that's pretty much all I'd like to talk about in this first little rave with the lunatic perfumer, with Crackpot Theories. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back with some more bits and pieces about aromatherapy, about ingredients, more stories. Thanks very much for watching.